So in the book, I've really talked about the maturity model, what describes where you are. And I think before we bring it up, one of the key points that I bring up in the book is that, to me, maturity in buyer centricity is not necessarily the whole organization. It's really important to look at it even from a department standpoint, because the reality is that a marketing team could be really buyer centric. They really focus on the target audience. They really do campaigns, but that doesn't mean your product team is.
Welcome to the Buyer-Centric OS. Buyer-Centric OS, a system for revolutionary customer experience. With your hosts, Andy Halko and Tony Zayas. This show helps you turn guesswork into growth by putting your buyer at the center of everything.
All right, today we're going to talk about how aligned you are as an organization in the standpoint of buyer centricity. We're going to be looking at the Buyer-Centric Maturity Model. So the question really is, Andy, is how do we turn those gut feelings about where we're at, being buyer-centric, into measurables, into something that is more systematic?
Yeah, we talked last time about, buyer centricity, customer centric approach needs to be systematic. It needs to be an operating system that you install, not a philosophy, not a poster on the wall. But part of a system is understanding where you are, what level of operating you are currently at. We think about an operating system. We've got to evaluate where do we stand to help us know not only, what needs to be improved, but when do we actually reach some success. And so in the book, I've really talked about the maturity model, what describes where you are. And I think before we bring it up, one of the key points that I bring up in the book is that, to me, maturity in buyer centricity is not necessarily the whole organization. It's really important to look at it even from a department standpoint, because the reality is that a marketing team could be really buyer centric. They really focus on the target audience. They really do campaigns, but that doesn't mean your product team is. That they may go off of gut instinct and, what features feel interesting to them in the moment. And they're not really engaging with customers enough and driving their roadmap based off of customers. And so, maturity to me is not just looking at it as how is our organization doing, but really each department. And I think this maturity model also helps establish the fact that, we can't just say we're customer centric. We have to actually, not only embed that system that we talked about, but we've got to realistically evaluate, are we truly doing these things or not? And so just to kind of bring it up a little bit, this is what we've defined as the maturity model. And there are 5 key stages to it, which we can talk about a little bit each. The first one we call the inside out operator. And, hopefully it's clear what that means, but you're operating from the inside out. And so that is what we just talked about with a product team, where they are more about, oh, here's the cool feature that we think would be really interesting to have. It's often that founder that, it's all coming out of their head, or the product manager and product team that just are more about like what their gut instinct thinks. It's marketing teams inside out that talk about the company. They're, celebrating their Inc. 5000, and they're really talking about, their process, their methodology. They're really just focused on them, but they rarely, almost never talk about the customer pain or the outcomes, right? Sales, where it's much more from the inside about, this is what would, we want to get you through the process. So it's that inside out operator really has no real connection and view on a regular basis to their customer or buyer, and they're never incorporating that into what they do.
So is it fair to say that most companies kind of assume they're further along in this process than what they really are? And how do you evaluate? How do you determine where you're at as an organization, as well as you mentioned departmentally? So I'd like to dive into that a little bit if possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in the book, I go into detail of there are certain things that you can judge of what you're doing to know where you are in the maturity model. And that is by department. So there are examples of in marketing, how often are you going back to your target customer before you create a campaign, let's say, or how well do you know the target customer from pains? Do you have that, what we've talked about in the past, that very superficial persona, or do you have real in-depth data and a twin of your target audience that you're using to leverage into campaigns? And so I do think for every department, there are some litmus test pieces that you can say, we're either doing this or we're not, and that helps judge where we are in this curve. I think to your original question, most companies think they're in the middle. Right. I don't think there's few that if you went and asked, like, are you customer centric, that an owner or a company would say, no, we don't care about them at all. But I think what happens is when you then dig deeper into the actions of the business, which we've talked about in, a couple of these prior shows, is that maybe they create a marketing campaign that first starts out customer centric, but then as that organizational gravity comes in and more people get involved in the campaign, all of a sudden it's about them instead of about the target. So I think that, a lot of people think they're in the middle or higher, but there is a real reality that probably most people are somewhere between that inside out operator and the reactive responder.
Yeah. And when I think about it, I would guess that from experience, most companies are probably 2 steps behind where they think they are, because we tend to think of, that one campaign where we really dug into those customer surveys or whatever. But when you think from a whole organization standpoint across departments, looking at the grand scheme of things, a lot of times it's, there is a lot of reactive thinking. There's a lot of just, inside out operation, et cetera. So
well, if you ask a leader, they're going to think of, oh, well, I had those 5 customer conversations 3 years ago.
Right.
And I used to be a customer I hear that quote all the time. I used to be a customer for this type of service. That's why I created it. Well, okay, that was 10 years ago. You're not anymore, and your mindset has changed. And so I think we can kind of talk a little bit more about some of these levels. The reactive responder. So that is the company that really they're reacting very quickly to buyer issues. So it's a lot of times customer support's reaching out and they're saying, okay, well, we're missing this piece. And all of a sudden you send it over to the product team and they're trying to build in a feature to handle that. Or, a customer says this on a call and all of a sudden you're a services company and you're trying to come up with a new offering for them. Or, any of these pieces, somebody sees something on LinkedIn and the marketing team all of a sudden just gravitates towards it and starts using it. And so they're reacting to customers, but they're not truly like proactively aligning to them.
Right.
And that's where we start getting into buyer aware explorer. This is the folks that are going a little bit beyond the personas and if they have them, they've at least got really in-depth ones. We've got, this is kind of that place really where a lot of companies start out talking about customers when they're thinking about features or marketing campaigns or sales approaches, but they start shifting away from it as those like organizational gravity, the biases, the other pieces pull them away. And so that's where you see a lot of people is in this buyer aware is they start out thinking customer, and they're the explorer. They really are early, but then as the day-to-day comes in, they really stop thinking about it. And then we move to the dynamic buyer aligned. This is really where I think organizations, obviously you want to aim to the top, but if you can get to this dynamic buyer aligned stage, I think it'd be really successful. That now you're really talking about building in timely feedback from customers. So now we're talking about we've got a feedback widget on our site, and we're encouraging folks to fill it out. And then we're actually taking that information and we're disseminating it, and then we're taking it out to all the departments of our company. Again, you may see a buyer aware one that says we've got a feedback widget, but that feedback goes to one person in the company and it's never shared with anybody else. That's where you start seeing that difference to the dynamic buyer aligned, is that it's not like we've got the widget and yeah, we've got a couple responses. It's we've got this feedback widget. We encourage our users to use it a lot. And then we actually take that information and we really try and push it across the company.
A big part of it is, I was just going to say, it sounds like a big part of it is breaking those silos at a certain point with, across company departments.
Yeah, I think as you move higher, it's, being intentional, being proactive, breaking silos. That's what it really does come down to, is that intentionality is that we are, instead of waiting for a customer to say something, we're going out and asking about it.
Right.
Proactive is similar, where, hey, we're creating a schedule for this. We are going to ask these specific customers once a month, and we're going to continue a cycle of going out and having conversations, and then bringing that back with the silos, and not just having one person in the organization filter it, but really taking that information and turning it into something real, and then pushing it out in the right ways to marketing, sales, product, operations, leadership, in a way that they're really, the organization then starts becoming customer buyer centric, like we're talking about, like everybody centers around that and comes back to it.
So what does that market synced organization look like? It sounds like that's when they've achieved that kind of buyer centricity, but how would you describe that?
Yeah, it really is that these pieces that we've talked about, intentionality. There is a lot of, we're building in systems. We are creating frequencies. We're putting that data in central sources. We're evaluating that information. We're then disseminating it to the team. We're then, making sure that we are including it in the actual actions. This is where you start getting into buyer centricity becomes part of OKRs. Like, have you in this meeting, have you taken this information and how have you actually used it in your job? And then the final layer is really measuring it, that you've got indicators that are more focused on the buyer than they are internal. Instead of a campaign that you're focused on clicks, you're trying to use measurements, which we'll talk about later, that help show was there resonance with the buyer, not just did they take an action, because clicks don't tell us anything, but resonance, making sure that our message and the campaign really connected with them, that's what we want to know. And so it really is, when you're at that market synced, you've got a cadence that you are going through to make sure that the organization is staying buyer centric, and then you've got measurement to make sure that you are, meeting a certain level of requirements and actually achieving something with buyer centricity.
Excellent. Well, this is an important concept in the whole buyer-centric operating system, this idea of the buyer-centric maturity model. We will go into more detail on implementation and things like that, other concepts in the book. If you guys have not gotten the book yet, please check it out. It's on Amazon, the Buyer-Centric Operating System. But thank you for your time, and we will be back with another episode, again, to help you move your organization into that market-synced organization, kind of the epitome of buyer centricity. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Buyer-Centric OS. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and grab your copy of the Buyer-Centric Operating System by Andy Halko, available now on Amazon. For more tools and insights, visit andyhalko.com.